Hi, welcome to our next content area. We're going to be starting to look at the art of early Europe and colonial America. Before we do that, though, we are going to finish up a little bit, and there's a transition period from the late Roman Empire into what we're going to study in this subunit, early Christian art. So we're going to look at some of the artwork from the late Roman Empire and talk a little bit about the Emperor Constantine. So this was the age of Constantine, who was the first Christian emperor. Barbarian groups began to move into the empire during the time of Marcus Aurelius. We talked about this in our last segment. Now pressed on Roman frontiers, these barbarians began to settle within the boundaries, disrupting provincial governments. As a perceived threat, empirical rule became more authoritarian, and eventually the military controlled most of the government and deposed rulers during the late part of the Roman Empire. So, following the assassination of the last Severian emperor in 235 CE, Rome was plunged into a period of anarchy that lasted 50 years. Real order was restored by Diocletian's military commander in 284 CE. He was able to reverse the declining empire, but as a result, initiated an increased autocratic form of rule, and the social structure of Rome became very rigid. To divide up the task of defending and administering the Roman Empire, Diocletian divided the empire into two parts in 286 CE. According to his plan, he would rule in the east, while the title of Augustus, while another Augustus would rule in the west. So you had two emperors, and they sort of divided the empire in half. In 239 CE, he devised a form of government called a tetrarchy, or a ruler of four, in which each Augustus designated a subordinate as their heir who held the title of Caesar. The Roman Empire, now divided into four quadrants, would be ruled by four individuals. This restructuring of the empire ushered in radically new hard style of geometricized abstraction, and it demonstrated, which you can see demonstrated in this portrait sculpture of the tetrarchs. So this is an image of the two Augustuses and the Caesars, and you can definitely see that it's very anti-classical. You know, the figures are not anatomically correct. Their bodies look kind of stunted. The drapery looks very stylized. So again, moving away towards this sort of abstraction and stylization in art during this period. So, you know, we see a loss of observation from nature to a more conceptual and stylized rendering. Figures lack canonical proportions and classicizing characteristics. We also see a loss of historical specificity. They all look the same except for the senior Augusti, who have beards, while the Caesars are depicted clean-shaven. So the beards represent the two Augustuses, who are the two emperors, and then the clean-shaven are the Caesars. They're sort of subordinates. They're dressed in military garb and clasping swords at their sides. They embrace each other in a show of imperial unity, proclaiming an alliance rooted in strength and diligence. The sculpture is made from porphyry, an extremely hard purple stone from Egypt that was reserved for imperial use. This form of government does not end up working well. And so here's a map of the late Roman Empire and how it was divided in half um, during the time of Diocletian. And then we kind of see the different quadrants of the four rulers during this period as well. And part of the problem with the Roman Empire is that it had just gotten too big to really keep under one ruler. I mean, it just got, it was huge. So these are some important dates that will sort of usher in this new historical period with early Christian art. in 313, the Edict of Milan. This is when Christianity officially was recognized in the Roman Empire. In 325, the Council of Nicaea, where Christianity became the state religion of Rome. So actually, Christianity started off as one of these sort of mystery cult religions that we talked about when we were discussing Roman panel painting in one of our first segments related to Roman art. So when Constantine Chlorus in 239 CE was elevated to the rank of Caesar, Constantine became a member of the court of Diocletian. Constantine proved an officer of much promise when serving under Diocletian's Caesar Galerius against the Persians. When Galerius was, with Galerius, when he died, in 311 AD, the main authority amongst the emperors had been removed, leaving them to struggle for dominance. In the east, Licinius and Maximus Dia fought for supremacy in the west, and in the west, Constantine began a war with Maxentius. Okay, in 312 CE, Constantine invaded Italy. Maxentius is believed to have had up to 4 times as many troops, though they were inexperienced and undisciplined. Constantine later claimed to have had a vision on the way to Rome when he was going to meet Maxentius in a battle. During the night before the battle, in his dream, he supposedly saw the Chi-Rho, C-H-I, with a dash, rho, R-O, and this is the symbol of Christ shining above the sun. Seeing this as a divine sign, it is said that Constantine had his soldiers paint the symbol on their shields. Following this, Constantine went on to defeat the numerically stronger army of Maxentius at the battle at the Milvian Bridge. Constantine saw the victory as directly related to the vision that he had had the night before. Henceforth, Constantine saw himself as an emperor of the Christian people. If this made him a Christian is subject of some debate, but Constantine, who only had himself baptized on his deathbed, is generally understood as the first Christian emperor of the Roman world. What you're looking at is a triumphal arch. Remember, a triumphal arch was sort of an arch of victory. It was usually, at the beginning of, the entrance of a forum or, into a city, usually having relief carvings that celebrated the accomplishments and victories of a leader. This triumphal arch is located next to the Colosseum. It is a heavily decorated triple passageway arch, one of the largest set up in Rome since the Severian dynasty. The building, however, took much of the sculptural decoration from earlier monuments of Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius. This technique of recycling sculptural decoration for other monuments is referred to as spolia, S-P-O-L-I-A. The use of spolia allowed Constantine to have the arch completed in a short amount of time, as well as linking his name with other great leaders he took or stole the sculptural decorations from. So basically, he kind of borrowed the relief carvings from other emperors in order to save time so the arch could be built, hopefully during his lifetime. And then he sort of kind of justified this by, saying, well, I'm trying to associate myself with these other great rulers. What you're looking at is the detail of Hadrian's medallions. These are relief sculptures that Constantine borrowed for his triumphal arch. So these medallions date about 200 years earlier. And you can see that style is very much inspired by early Greek and Roman classical art. So when we look at these, we really see that sort of classical style. The boar hunt depicted demonstrates Hadrian's courage and prowess, and his sacrificial offering to Apollo shows he has piety, gratitude to the gods for their support. The classicizing heads and the form-enhancing drapery and graceful poses of the figure really, signify it and show it as a work from almost as, that it was heavily influenced by classical Greek art. Hadrian's head has been recarved to look more like Constantine um, in these medallions. What you're looking at now is at the bottom. This is Constantine's frieze. So these are Hadrian's medallions, and underneath it, we actually see a relief carving that was, actually carved during the period of Constantine's rule. So it's located below the medallions, and it really reflects the current style of the period. The scene depicts Constantine distributing bread out into the forum, showing his benevolence. So, how does the frieze differ stylistically from the earlier medallions? So let me kind of zoom in so you can get a better look. There, I think that's good. Maybe a little bit more. So one thing you might want to note is that there's a greater use of hora vacui. This was a term we encountered when we were looking at Greek, ancient Greek vase painting. And this is the notion of fear of negative space. And so we definitely see a loss of illusionistic space. All those figures in the frieze are really kind of crammed together and sort of compressed. The relief carving is much more shallow, and that also adds to the compression of the space. And when we look closely at the figures, we really see, again, this loss of canonical proportion. The figures are blocky, they're stunted looking with large heads, and so they're very anti-classical compared to the figures in Hadrian's medallions. So it's an interesting piece to look at because we see really this sort of shift from this sort of classical style into what is really going to dominate the forthcoming medieval period. So one thing to keep in mind is that it's not that the artist under Constantine's rule didn't understand canonical proportion or this idea of observing from nature. What our art historians think is that artists were more focused on conveying an idea than demonstrating or trying to imitate the natural world. And so that's going to be a real important theme when we look at medieval art. All right, so what you're looking at here is a sculpture. It's a portrait of Constantine from the Basilica Nova. The sculptor used white marble for the head, chest, and arms and legs. Sheets of bronze served as the drapery for the figure, while all the other elements were supported on a wooden frame. The statue became a permanent stand-in for the emperor, representing him whenever the conduct of business legally required his presence. So essentially, this colossal statue, if he wasn't, able to be present at some sort of business or some sort of administrative function, this would serve as his stand-in. And again, we really see this kind of movement away from the movement that's very anti-classical. The head does combine features of traditional Roman portraiture, but with some of the abstract qualities evident in the first sculpture we looked at of the Tetrarchs. The defining characteristics of Constantine's face, heavy jaw, hooked nose, and jutting chin, have been incorporated into a stylized symmetrical pattern in which other features, such as his eyes, eyebrows, and hair, have been simplified into repeated geometric arcs. So we have this sort of infusion of historical specificity, but also, again, this movement towards stylization and abstraction and other features. The result is a work that projects imperial power and dignity with a hint of human frailty or imperfection. So now we're going to enter officially into our next subunit, which is early Christian art. It's important that you understand that sort of transition from the late empire into this medieval period. To see that sort of movement away from from classical works of art. Christianity, in its first 3 centuries, was one of a large number of mystery religions that flourished in the Roman world. These are characteristics. There are characteristics Christianity shares with numerous other mystery cults. In early Christianity, an emphasis is placed on baptism, which marked the initiation of the convert into the secrets of or mysteries of the faith. The Christian emphasis on the belief in salvation and an afterlife is consistent with other mystery cults. The monotheism of Christianity, though, was a crucial difference from other cults. The refusal of the early Christians to participate in the civic cults due to their monotheistic beliefs led to their persecutions. And because of this, and Christians were seen as antisocial. So here we're looking at a map of Europe. Toward the end of the Roman Empire, Christianity is starting to take root. Pagan religions are still going on. New Christians are forging ahead and trying to convey their ideas and beliefs. Ancient Roman art is all around them. What we will see is that Christians will adapt Roman forms and iconography to convey Christian ideals. This period of art is not so much about style, but more of a historical designation. All right, so what you're looking at is an image of the catacombs of Calixtus in the 2nd century. Catacombs are subterranean corridors and chambers where Christians buried their dead. Early Christians did not believe in cremation. Entrances to these interiors were disguised, and burial services were conducted in secret. Christians puzzled and disturbed the emperor's soldiers, again, because they were sort of seen as antisocial. Christians claimed to be good citizens. They did not revolt. They paid taxes. However, they refused to participate in sacrifice to the emperor. Before Constantine, the emperor Diocletian persecuted the Christians a great deal. This is another view of the Catacomb of Calixtus. Very little is known about the art of the first Christians. When an art historian speaks of early Christian art, they are talking about the earliest preserved works, not the artwork of the first Christians. Catacombs are subterranean corridors and chambers where Christians buried dead. And again, using iconography and other sort of symbols, these entrances were often disguised. In accordance with Roman law, the dead had to be buried outside the city's walls on private property. Christian families often pooled funds together in a burial association, and the now labyrinth catacombs started off much more modest. Loculi, openings to receive the bodies of the dead, this is spelled Loculi, might be loculi, were cut into the rock. So this is what you're looking at here. Often small rooms carved out of the rock called cubicula, we've heard this term as in Roman houses, were used as a mortuary chamber. So this is sort of the cubicula, the actual room. As Christians gained converts, these new Christians had been brought up on the value of images in their previous cultural experience, and they wanted to continue this in their Christian experience. For example, there was a change in burial practices in the Roman world, away from cremation to inhumation. So inhumation is, actually burying the body. Outside the city walls of Rome, adjacent to major roads, catacombs were dug into the ground to bury the dead. Families would have chambers or cubicula dug to bury their members. Wealthy Romans would also have a sarcophagi or marble tombs carved for their burial. The Christians, converts wanted the same thing. Christian catacombs were dug frequently adjacent to non-Christian ones, and sarcophagi with Christian imagery were apparently popular with the richer Christians. After Christianity received official approval under Constantine, churches began to arise above the catacombs, and Christians could openly worship um, martyrs. They could openly worship the martyrs, men and women who had chosen to die for their religious beliefs. And often a lot of these churches would sprout on their burial sites. So in the beginning, Christians had to practice, in secret, in these catacomb spaces. And then when Christianity becomes accepted, then we start to see the sprouting of amazing church architecture. So the creation and nature of Christian art was directly impacted by these moments. So early Christian art does not differ from contemporary counterparts of secular Roman art in style and technique, only in content. Some catacomb paintings even depict traditional Greco-Roman myths. The ceiling in a Roman catacomb is similar in format to the painted vaults of some Roman apartment houses, but subjects come from the Hebrew scriptures in the New Testament. The composition of this work is composed on a circle frame with a central medallion and lunettes. These are semicircular frames. And at the center of the medallion is an image of Jesus as the Good Shepherd with sheep around him. The sheep were meant to symbolize his soldiers. If Roman officials discovered this painting, they would not make the Christian association and literally think it was a charming country scene with a shepherd. And so this is sort of how they disguised their Christian iconography. The beginnings of an identifiable Christian art can be traced to the end of the 2nd century and the beginning of the 3rd century. Considering the Old Testament prohibitions against graven images, it is important to consider why Christian art developed in the first place. The use of images will be a continuing issue in the history of Christianity. The best explanation for the emergence of Christian art in the early church is due to the important role images played in Greco-Roman culture. So when we look at some of the individual lunettes, they contained key episodes from the biblical story of Jonah and the whale. The Greek word for whale was katos, or sea dragon. And that is how the artist represented the monstrous marine creature. So this is him right here, and we can see it really doesn't look like a whale. It looks like a dragon of some sort. So the detail shows Jonah coming out of the well. The figure of Jonah is in a gesture of prayer where hands are spread outward. This is referred to as an orant figure, a standing figure with both arms raised. This was a gesture of prayer in the early Christian period. In the story of Jonah, he is swallowed by a whale and stays inside of it for 3 days. He is spit out from the belly of the whale. The figure of Jonah is similar to Christ, who was laid in a tomb for 3 days. This comparison is known as prefiguration, idea of an Old Testament prefiguring the New Testament symbolism. Again, if Roman officials were to discover the tomb with these decorations, they would not understand the symbolism and attribute this detail to being a mere sort of fantasy landscape. And so that's what's going on here. You have this central figure of Christ, and then you have these lunettes, being, Christ representing the New Testament, and then you have these scenes that sort of prefigure many of the stories of Christ. And that's something that we'll see artists in other historical periods incorporate as well. Stylistically, what are some differences compared to earlier Greco-Roman classical works? Again, the level of illusionism and canonical proportions are not there. Reasons for this could be that it was hard to paint in the darkness of the catacomb. It's also very hard to paint on a ceiling as well. And also the smell of rotting corpses was probably not all that pleasant either. So what you're looking at is another catacomb. This is the catacomb of Priscilla. on Via Salaria in Rome, Italy. It's situated in what was a quarry in Roman times. The quarry was used for Christian burials from the late 2nd century through the 4th century. Some of the walls and ceilings display fine decorative illustrated Bible scenes. The catacomb of Priscilla's are believed to be named after Priscilla, a member of the gens Aquileia, and who was probably the wife of the consul Achillas, who became a Christian and was killed on the orders of Domitian. They contained a number of wall paintings of saints and early Christian symbols. One thing I want you to note here is that we see sort of the first style of panel wall painting that we looked at when we were studying Roman art and we were looking at some of the mural paintings done in Pompeii. And so that's that masonry style where the Roman panel painting um, is made to look like or mimic marble. So it's an illusion. We're going to be focusing on some frescoes painted in the catacomb of Priscilla. The Orant fresco that you're looking at here depicts 3 stages of the life of a woman. The central figure represents an orant figure. We talked about that earlier with the figure of Jonah as a standing figure with both arms raised. This was a gesture of prayer in the early Christian period. On the left side, she is getting married, and on the right side, she is raising children. Note the modeling and shading on her face. Roman panel painting, with its sense of naturalism, is still slightly alive and during this period. So we do see that influence. Some early Christian symbols that we're going to encounter and encounter in other works of art, later works of art from other periods. The dove represents peace and the Holy Spirit, and we can see that depicted to the side. There's also a peacock, which is representing eternal life, and then a quail representing the earthbound life. And again, a fresco is, wet plaster with pigment painted directly onto the wet plaster, and then the two fuse together, and you end up with this fresco painting. What you're looking at is another fresco painting of the Good Shepherd from the Catacomb of Priscilla. I'm so sorry, this is a terrible picture, but I could not find a decent one, and probably too, it's in really bad condition, the actual work itself. The Good Shepherd fresco shows us early depictions of Christ. How is he different than what our perceptions of him are today? When we look at earlier depictions of Christ, he's usually shown as a beardless younger man, teaching his disciples much like a Greek philosopher. Note the Old Testament scenes that surround the central figure of Christ. So again, we have this idea of prefiguration. Again, this notion in early Christian art of depicting Old Testament persons and events as prophetic forerunners of Christ in the New Testament events. Here's hopefully a better detail. And so this will be an interesting comparison because what we're going to see is that this image of Christ, starts off literally like a shepherd. Eventually, we'll see the beard. We'll see him more in an imperial style dress. But this early version of Christ is definitely not what we think of today when we think of the figure of Jesus. And so it'll be interesting to sort of compare and see the evolution of how his depiction changes throughout art history. Okay, I'm going to stop here. In our next segment, we're going to be looking at early Christian church architecture. This is where Christianity is accepted and then officially becomes the official religion of Rome. And we'll start to see some of these early Christian church basilicas. So stay tuned.